example that if you just pay people to dig holes, and bury a pot of gold and pay them to fill it up again, and then let private enterprise go and dig it up again, that's what government needs to do. Get the flow going, get people active, get the economy working. And that's exactly what happened with the Second World War. As people recognize, the overcoming of the last depression was really as a result of the Second World War. And since then, since the Second World War, that's been our mantra. Jane Jacobs, the great urban theorist who lived in Toronto and died a couple of years ago, wrote how we're still haunted by the Depression. Not just, as you've seen in the last year, not just because of economic downturn, the economics, but particularly fear of joblessness. The specter of thousands of people lining up in dusty fields looking for work and migrating across the country, that drives our psyche in fundamental ways. And that's true. I think that's very true, that we're driven by the past. We're backing into the future out of fear of the past. So the goal of government is to keep that economy going. And we put in place an architecture with all the trading arrangements and so on after the Second World War that has made sure that has happened. And now as we face this depression, this seeming depression, or potential depression, the stimulus package has been the answer to it. So what I'm saying here is that government, our government, the only thing we have to turn to is actually as embedded in the problem we're trying to solve as anybody else. Governments are ones that give out tenures to the forest industry in order to keep employment going, who turn over lands to mineral prospectors and mines to fuel that economy, or subsidize large agricultural industries to get bigger, and provide new energy subsidies for run-of-river or for windmills or whatever. Our government is deeply dependent, entrenched in this large-scale economic process and deeply dependent upon it. Just recently, it was, I think, noted that part of the reason arts funding has been cut in BC and lots of social welfare programs have been cut is because the gas revenues in BC have gone down $1 billion. Our government depends upon people using gas. And interestingly enough, with the harmonized sales tax, one of the exemptions that this government, which has put in a carbon tax in order to encourage people not to use energy, exemptions is for gasoline, airplane fuel, is exempted from this new HST. So with governments both part of the dependency and also trying to solve these problems, we have incoherence. We have an incoherent response to this global crisis that we confront. In my field, in the law school, environmental law is a perfect example of that. Environmental law is totally dependent upon government regulating to protect the environment. So we get problems where the frustration of environmentalists who want to see fish farms removed because maybe they're going to undermine the entire millions of years of evolution with their salmon species. No, the governments depend on supporting those resources, those economies. Or the incoherence of putting in the Gateway project that will lead more traffic and more fuel being done and more exports going off to China at the same time as we're supposedly trying to reduce our carbon footprint. And so I want to just quote from Gus Speth, again, who's, as I say, an insider, his comment about the effect on democracy. What does this mean? All we have is democracy. That's it. We have to make change through our voice as citizens. Quote, Washington today is more a problem than a solution. It is hooked on GDP growth, for its revenues, for its constituencies, and for its influence abroad. It is being captured by the very corporations and concentration of wealth it should be seeking to regulate and revamp, a pattern that has now reached alarming proportions. This is an insider. And it is hobbled by an array of dysfunctional institutional arrangements. Peter Barnes explains the problem starkly. Quote, the reason capitalism distorts democracy is simple. Democracy is an open system, and economic power can easily infect it. By contrast, capitalism is a gated system. Its bastions aren't easily accessed by the masses. So I would argue that what we need to do in run-of-the-river is, with run-of-the-river or any of our environmental problems, is recognize we are trapped. We have nowhere to turn. We have an economy in which we're all embedded, which works to create great levels of wealth for some, but by impoverishing the planet and overusing it on these hugely shooting up patterns in our graphs of resource and consumption. We have a momentum that resists change. We have nowhere to turn. Interestingly, though, the chaos that is coming is one that is widely shared and seen across the spectrum. People like Jeff Rubin, the former economist, The Economist, who worked in the financial sector in Toronto, has written the book, Your World is about to get a whole lot smaller, in which he says the energy crisis is going to lead to booms and busts. Prices going shooting up, causing recessions, crashes, up and down. And the only out for that is a much retracted global economy. Trade will become too expensive because we won't have the energy to fuel it. William Kunstler? James Kunstler wrote The Long Emergency, the book The Long Emergency. Same sort of argument, that it's an emergency that we face, but it's a long one because we're not dealing with it. As oil runs down, as resources get scarce, we're going to find ourselves with fewer and fewer options. Tad Homer Dixon from Victoria, his book The Upside of Down, who argues, and I think this is a great insight, that really what we are going to do and what we need is a crash. He says, is it going to be a catastrophe, or is it going to be, what's the word he uses, a problem that's solvable? And his question is, how big an upset do we need to be able to make basic changes? And so that, I think, is the context within which we need to deal with environmental problems. Not that there's single solvable ones by simply tackling carbon. And it's not that easy to tackle because it's not about carbon. It's about energy use. It's about our economy. And we need to do it not by looking back, but by looking ahead. And I want to just conclude with a couple of ways to look ahead. Just recently, the German government released a report in which they said the numbers are all off. Forget it. It's way faster, way more problematic than any of the current studies. We're way beyond the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they concluded that the American government, the United States, has to become carbon neutral. That is to say, putting no carbon in the atmosphere at all, zero, down to carbon neutral by 2020. And I haven't, maybe I've got the quote here, he said, like, I'm stunned by my own numbers. And what he called for was a green Apollo project, right? We got a decade to get to the moon. An Apollo project raises all kinds of issues that are kind of not really what he wants, but a commitment, a huge commitment to a green world. And I think that's correct. I think what we need is to be able to see, back during the election, one of the phrases that was thrown out was, it's a wartime emergency. It's a wartime emergency. At the conclusion of that argument was, and we got to put in all kinds of run-of-river projects because it's a wartime emergency in order to get carbon out, right? And therefore anybody who's opposed to this is not legitimate, was the kind of underpinning. Well, if it is a wartime emergency, then we have to do a very different type of response. First of all, we need to open up our consideration of what types of economies can work. What types of communal-based economies, what types of low growth and non-growth economies, and how can we create those? Local new economic forms. The people like Jeff Rubin, an investment guru, says is necessary, and people like Kunstler, a social critic, also say is necessary. And I think we have to recognize, and this is kind of the flip side to me of the climate change challenge and all these coming together of these crises, is it may be our last chance to build what we need to build in order to have a quality of life on this planet for hundreds of years to come. It is going to become more and more and more difficult to muster the economic and the physical resources to build infrastructure that we need. We don't have a sustainable infrastructure. We need to be able to do different forms of transportation, whether it's, bicycle routes or train systems or ones that are much